There are nights when the heart grows unusually still, not because love has faded, but because it is quietly waiting, careful, almost afraid of being misread. And if these words have reached you in such a moment, it may be that a part of you is tired of acting like nothing matters anymore, while another part still holds a quiet hope that someone, somewhere, is holding on to you just as deeply. Because what most people don't realize is this: someone can love you more than you are able to see. Not in the loud, polished way stories describe love, not through perfect timing or flawless expression, but through uncertainty, emotional conflict, hesitation, and distance that hides fear rather than indifference. Before you convince yourself that everything is already over, there is something important you need to understand, something people often only recognize when it is too late. Silence does not always mean the end of love. In many cases, silence is what love looks like when it becomes too heavy for someone to express without breaking inside. Human beings become complicated when love becomes real. We spend so much time imagining that deep connection is what we want, yet when it actually arrives and touches the hidden, unhealed parts of us, something inside begins to shake. Carl Jung described the unconscious mind like a vast, unseen ocean beneath human behavior, and in many ways, that is exactly what gets stirred in intimate connection. Because real love does not only interact with the surface of who we are, it reaches into what we have buried: old insecurities, forgotten pain, the need to finally be chosen without conditions, the loneliness we learn to ignore. And when someone unknowingly awakens these layers, it does not always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels destabilizing. This is why a person can care deeply about you and still step back at the very moment you are closest. On the surface, it looks like contradiction, but psychologically, it often comes from overwhelm. Love is not only comfort, it is exposure. It is standing emotionally visible in front of another person and hoping your vulnerability is safe in their hands. Yet not everyone was taught how to handle that kind of emotional closeness. Some people learned to endure disappointment, some learned to stay strong by shutting down feelings, some learned to survive by keeping emotional distance. But they never learned how to stay open when love begins to feel real and personal. So when they connect with you, something shifts inside them that they cannot easily explain. Your presence starts to matter more than they expected. Your silence feels heavier than it should. Your attention becomes emotionally significant, and your absence begins to echo in ways they are not prepared for, and that is where fear quietly enters, because the moment someone realizes another person can affect their inner emotional stability, something in the subconscious begins to register risk. Losing you starts to feel possible. Attachment begins to feel like exposure. And what once felt like comfort slowly begins to feel like something they could be hurt by. This is where many people misunderstand love. They assume emotional distance means lack of feeling. But often, distance is not absence of love. It is the presence of too much emotion with no safe way to hold it. There are people who go cold because they do not care. And there are others who withdraw because they care more than they know how to manage. The second type is far more complex because their emotions move toward connection while their fear pushes them away from it. One part of them reaches for closeness. Another part quietly asks, "What if this ends like everything else did?" And without even realizing it, they begin protecting themselves from a pain that has not yet happened. You may have already noticed signs of this inner conflict. Moments of warmth followed by sudden silence. The way they seem emotionally present and then distant again. The way they observe you quietly when they think you are not noticing. The way small details about you stay in their memory without effort. The unspoken tension that lingers even in ordinary interactions. And still, something feels unfinished, as if part of them is leaning toward you while another part keeps stepping back. What you are seeing is often the surface of unresolved emotional experience. And contrary to what many assume, emotional wounds are not always loud or obvious. They are often subtle. They exist inside attachment patterns, in fear of vulnerability, in learned emotional withdrawal. Some people disconnect the moment they start caring deeply because closeness unconsciously awakens memories of past emotional pain. Maybe they were abandoned before. Maybe vulnerability once led to rejection or humiliation. Maybe they grew up in an environment where expressing emotion was unsafe or ignored. And the difficult truth is that they may not consciously understand any of this. The subconscious mind shapes far more behavior than people realize. A person can genuinely love someone and still act in ways that disrupt the connection, simply because their nervous system associates intimacy with emotional danger. So they send mixed signals, not always out of intention, but out of internal confusion. They want closeness, but closeness triggers fear. They long for intimacy, but intimacy exposes them. This is why emotionally deep love requires patience in a way that goes far beyond excitement or attraction. Passion comes easily, but real connection asks something much harder. It asks a person to slowly remove their emotional defenses, to trust again after disappointment, to stay open even when uncertainty feels uncomfortable. And for many, that process feels like risk. It is also important to understand something about silence. Silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is internal processing. Some people express emotions outwardly. Others turn inward when feelings become too intense. They retreat into thought, confusion, or emotional sorting. Especially those who have learned to suppress vulnerability often use silence as a form of emotional protection, not rejection. But the problem is that silence creates interpretation gaps. One person experiences it as distance or abandonment, while the other is simply overwhelmed inside. And slowly, two people who care about each other begin to drift. Not because love disappeared, but because fear became louder than communication. This is where many connections break too early. People mistake emotional complexity for emotional absence. They expect love to always look clear, steady, and easy. But meaningful emotional bonds rarely are. They reach into deeper layers of identity. They activate inner fears, old wounds, and hidden insecurities. Carl Jung believed that love often acts as a mirror, reflecting not only affection, but also the parts of ourselves we have not fully healed. And that is why some relationships feel so intense on a psychological level. They awaken awareness. They reveal emotional patterns you did not know were still active inside you. Fear of abandonment, difficulty receiving love, overgiving, hidden loneliness, a quiet need for reassurance. Without realizing it, another person becomes connected not only to who you are, but to what you have not yet resolved within yourself. And the other person may be going through the same internal experience. They might be lying awake, replaying conversations, pretending during the day that they are unaffected. They might be resisting the urge to reach out, held back by pride or fear. They might miss you deeply while convincing themselves that distance is safer. Because in the end, one of the most painful truths about human psychology is this. People often hurt the ones they love most, not because they care less, but because those are the only ones who have the power to hurt them deeply in return. That shift in perspective changes everything once you begin to see people through a psychological frame instead of reacting only from emotion, because at that point, you stop labeling every confusing behavior as simple disinterest. You start noticing the quieter layers underneath it, defense mechanisms shaping actions, delayed responses, emotional inconsistency, sudden withdrawal after moments of closeness, restraint that often hides fear more than indifference. None of this becomes healthy just because it is understandable, but it does become deeply human. And maybe this is the uncomfortable truth you needed to face today. Not every emotionally distant person is emotionally empty. Some are simply emotionally drained from spending years surviving life with a guarded heart. There are people who walk through life carrying silent grief that no one ever acknowledged. People who learn to function independently because relying on others once led to pain. People who still long for softness but panic when it actually arrives in a stable form. People who became familiar with chaos and now struggle to recognize calm love as safe. If this person genuinely cares about you, their internal experience may be far more complex than what is visible on the surface. But there is another side to this truth that cannot be ignored. Love alone cannot compensate for the absence of emotional growth. You cannot heal someone who refuses to face their own inner patterns. You cannot continuously sacrifice your emotional stability in the hope that your presence will eventually fix another person's fear. Real connection requires mutual emotional responsibility. Compassion is necessary, but so is self-respect. Understanding someone's wounds should never come at the cost of abandoning your own emotional needs. This is where emotional maturity becomes essential. Mature love does not beg for minimal attention. It does not slowly erode itself in the name of proving worth. It does not endlessly chase while neglecting personal boundaries. Instead, it understands patience without self-erasure. It offers space without disappearing. It remains compassionate without losing direction. And sometimes the most meaningful form of love is not forcing closeness, but allowing space for honest self-confrontation. Because no one can be transformed from the outside. Change only happens when a person becomes internally exhausted by repeating the same emotional cycles. It is possible this connection did not enter your life only to bring love, but also to bring awareness, to help you recognize the difference between attachment and true emotional alignment, to show you how deeply you need reciprocity, consistency, and emotional clarity, to reveal the moments when you ignored your own inner voice because the fear of loss felt stronger than intuition. Think about it honestly. Have there been times when something inside you already knew the truth before your mind accepted it? Moments where you could feel the emotional reality of someone even when their words suggested otherwise. Human beings are far more intuitive than they often believe. The subconscious constantly reads emotional signals, tone shifts, silence patterns, body language, timing, energy changes, even subtle tension. Long before logic forms conclusions, something deeper already registers truth. That is why certain connections are impossible to forget, not because they were flawless, but because they awakened something dormant inside you. And awakening is rarely comfortable. Sometimes it arrives through confusion, sometimes through longing, sometimes through emotional distance that forces deep internal reflection, sometimes through missing someone so intensely that you finally meet parts of yourself you were avoiding. Psychologically, pain has a revealing function. It dissolves illusions, it exposes emotional reality, it highlights where healing is still incomplete. And this is why some relationships change you internally even when they never stabilize externally. They push awareness, they disrupt emotional patterns, they force growth. And perhaps this person is also standing at the edge of their own transformation. Maybe they are beginning to realize that avoidance no longer protects them the way it once did. Maybe your absence has created space for emotions they previously suppressed. Maybe they are slowly understanding that love cannot survive indefinitely inside silence and pride, because eventually every person reaches a point where emotional loneliness becomes heavier than fear. And in that moment, change begins, not suddenly, not perfectly, but gradually. They start noticing the emotional walls they built. They recognize how often fear influenced their decisions. They see how many chances for genuine connection were lost in the name of self-protection. And for the first time, they begin to understand that emotional safety is not created through avoidance, but through openness. This kind of realization can be life-altering. But while they navigate their inner process, you are required to continue navigating yours as well. Do not let uncertainty weaken your sense of self-worth. Do not allow someone else's confusion to convince you that you are difficult to love. The way a person responds to emotional intimacy often reflects their internal world far more than it reflects your value. Many emotionally distant individuals are not withholding love because you are unworthy of it. They are withholding because closeness activates fear inside them. Fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of being emotionally exposed, fear of losing control. And paradoxically, the deeper their feelings become, the more vulnerable they feel. This creates an internal conflict, One part of them desires closeness, while another part resists it. And unless that conflict is consciously healed, they remain caught between connection and withdrawal. But you were never meant to carry the emotional weight of both people in a connection. You can care deeply and still protect your own emotional balance. You can understand someone without excusing repeated inconsistency. Compassion is not meant to become self-erasure. This is one of the most important realizations emotional awareness brings. Love should expand you, not diminish you. And yet, even within all this complexity, meaningful connections still exist. Rare ones, where two people slowly learn each other's fears with patience instead of judgment, where emotional defenses soften over time, where both individuals choose awareness over ego and growth over avoidance. But these connections require something most people struggle with: honesty, emotional responsibility, vulnerability, patience, and courage. Above all, they require the willingness to face oneself. Because every real relationship eventually becomes a mirror. You cannot fully love another person while remaining disconnected from your own emotional truth. This is where deeper psychological work begins, not as a concept, but as lived experience. Facing jealousy instead of denying it, facing fear instead of masking it, facing loneliness instead of distracting from it, facing emotional patterns instead of repeating them unconsciously. Until that inner work is done, relationships often continue circling the same emotional lessons in different forms, and maybe this connection is part of that process for both of you. Maybe it became too emotionally real to ignore, too psychologically revealing to dismiss, too intimate in its impact to remain unchanged by. Because people do not struggle this deeply over connections that mean nothing to them. Real emotional conflict only exists where real attachment exists. That is why indifference feels simple and empty, while love feels layered, confusing, and alive. When someone truly does not care, their emotional presence becomes flat. But when someone cares deeply while battling internal fear, their emotional energy becomes inconsistent, charged, and unpredictable. And even in silence, that inner conflict is often still felt. You've likely already felt it, that pull that doesn't fully make sense. That sense of something unfinished, as if beneath all the silence there is still something real, quietly existing. And maybe that has made you question yourself more than once. Maybe a part of you keeps wondering whether you are reading too much into it, whether your mind is filling in gaps that are not really there. But deep emotional intuition rarely appears without reason. The subconscious mind is constantly reading what words cannot fully express: patterns, pauses, emotional tone, distance, and energy shifts that logic often notices too late. Still, intuition alone is not enough. It has to be grounded in clarity, because there is also a danger in staying too long in emotional uncertainty, especially when intensity begins to feel like meaning. The nervous system can become attached to emotional highs and lows, mistaking instability for depth. And over time, unpredictability can start to feel like connection, even when it is actually confusion. This is why healing changes what you are drawn to. When emotional patterns begin to settle, you stop chasing confusion just because it feels intense. You stop confusing emotional distance with mystery. You stop believing that love must feel difficult to be real. Instead, you begin to value what is steady: clarity, consistency, honesty, and emotional safety. And maybe this experience is slowly leading you toward that understanding. Not every person enters your life to complete you. Some enter to awaken you, to expand your awareness, to raise your standards, to show you that love is not meant to be an endless guessing game where you constantly question where you stand. At the same time, transformation is not instant for anyone involved. If this person genuinely cares for you, they may be carrying an internal struggle that is invisible from the outside. A quiet conflict between old emotional wounds and new feelings, between fear and desire, between the instinct to protect themselves and the pull toward emotional closeness. And maybe, somewhere in their private world, they are replaying your presence, your words, your absence, trying to understand what it means and whether they have already lost something important by staying silent too long. Because human beings often carry regret more heavily than rejection. Many people avoid vulnerability in the moment, only to realize later that silence itself became the reason for the loss they feared. It is easy to underestimate how deeply someone can feel something they are not yet able to express. Some of the most intense emotional experiences are not loud or visible. They exist beneath restraint, hidden behind control, pride, or fear of exposure. That is part of what makes love so complex. It brings together two people who may both care deeply, yet struggle to show it clearly. Two nervous systems shaped by different histories, two inner worlds carrying unseen emotional scars, two vulnerable parts of the self silently asking the same question: will I still be accepted if I am fully seen? And often, beneath all the silence and distance, that is exactly what is happening. A person may not be pulling away because they feel nothing, but because they fear they are not enough, or that their feelings will eventually lead to loss. So they protect themselves in advance, believing emotional distance will soften the impact of possible heartbreak. But love does not become safer just because it is hidden. Suppressed emotion still weighs heavily. Silence still creates pain. Distance still leaves emotional residue. And over time, what is unspoken begins to create its own kind of exhaustion. That is why emotional honesty matters so deeply. Not emotional performance, not confusion disguised as love, but truth. The kind of truth that is simple and vulnerable at the same time. I care. I am afraid. I do not fully know how to handle this, but you matter to me. Those moments, when someone becomes emotionally honest instead of emotionally guarded, are often the moments that reshape a connection entirely. But until that happens, your responsibility is not to lose yourself inside uncertainty. Keep growing, keep healing, keep returning to your own emotional center instead of orbiting someone else's confusion, because your worth is not defined by how clearly another person can express themselves, and your needs for consistency, clarity, and emotional presence are not excessive, they are healthy. Do not let emotional inconsistency convince you that you are difficult to love. Often, it only reflects someone else's internal struggle with closeness, not your value as a person. Real love should not require constant interpretation to feel secure. It may not be perfect, but it should feel emotionally safe enough to exist in without confusion becoming the norm. And one day, whether with this person or someone else aligned with your emotional depth, you will not have to decode silence or question presence. You will not have to wonder where you stand. Emotional honesty will be direct, not hidden. Affection will not constantly fight fear. Connection will not feel like guessing. But even now, there may still be something this experience is teaching both of you. Maybe it is awareness. Maybe it is healing. Maybe it is closure. Maybe it is the beginning of courage. Only time reveals that. Still, do not dismiss the quiet truth your heart may already sense. What you felt was not imaginary. It was real in its impact, even if it was complicated in its expression. Some people do love deeply while still struggling internally with how to show it. Not because their love is uncertain, but because they are uncertain about themselves. And sometimes emotional growth only begins when silence becomes heavy enough that it can no longer be ignored. So until clarity arrives, protect your peace. Stay open, but not lost. Stay compassionate, but not self-abandoning. Stay understanding, but not at the cost of your own emotional stability. Because the people who continue to believe in love even after confusion are often the ones who eventually recognize it in its clearest form. And maybe, in time, you will look back at this not as a story of uncertainty alone, but as the moment you learned the difference between emotional intensity and emotional truth and chose yourself enough to no longer confuse the two.